Alright, we are back with a new video, and today we'll be breaking down the top 10 worst episodes of MLP Friendship is Magic. Now, despite the title of this video, this is actually part of a much bigger project that I'm working on where I'm ranking every single MLP episode in the show. And I spent the last couple of months or so doing season episode rankings, breaking down the rankings for each individual season. And then now that that process is done, it's now time to basically combine all those lists into one big ranking. And obviously, this is going to be a pretty big undertaking. And on the face of it, it would make for a very long video. And despite me being in favor of longer videos, I figured that for this process, it was probably better to divide it into several parts. And how I decided to do that was to divide it into 4 parts. Part 1, which is what you're watching right now, is going to be the top 10 worst episodes in the series. So basically the bottom 10 of this list. Part 4, the final part, is going to be the top 10 episodes in the entire series. And then parts 2 and 3 are essentially going to be everything else, where I'm basically going to divide it around the 100 spot on the list. So basically part 3 is essentially going to be the top 100 with the exception of the top 10. And I know what some people are thinking with this. I mean, this is obviously going to make for some pretty lopsided videos, where parts 2 and 3 are going to be pretty ridiculous in length. However, there are 2 main reasons why I decided to go with this approach for doing this. One is I really want the top 10 and the bottom 10 to really mean something, like in terms of this list, but also for my own sake. Like, I want to say that a top 10 episode really means something, or a worst episode to really mean something. And I figured that really dedicating an entire video just for the very best and the very worst is a proper way of really separating those episodes from the rest of the pack, so that if an episode is good or bad enough to make either of those lists, then it really means something and it'll really stand out. So I figured that would be a cool honor or dishonor, I guess, to associate with those episodes. But also the other reason is a bit more practical, in that I wanted to strike a balance between fulfilling my own personal desire to make an insanely long ranking video, the type of thing that you can just lie down in bed and just listen to without having to worry about switching the video, but also with the people that really like just a condensed top 10, bottom 10, and such of sorts. So basically, I'm sort of fulfilling 2 purposes with this regard, where I'm still having the top 10 video and then the bottom 10 video, but then everything else is being condensed into a pretty substantial video, within reason, of course. So really, that's the other reason I'm going with this approach. Now, before we get started with the actual list, I figured I'd lay down some criteria, lay out some ground rules for what exactly I'm ranking, and then we can sort of proceed from here. If you've already seen some of my previous MLP episode rankings, then this shouldn't come as too big of a surprise here, but I'll talk about it anyway. So for this list, I am only looking at the main series of MLP Friendship is Magic. I am not going to be reviewing or ranking anything from Equestria Girls, although I do plan on doing some Equestria Girls videos in the future, so stay tuned for those. I am also not including any movies, specials, or shorts that exist outside the main core series. So basically, I am just looking at the episodes from the main Friendship is Magic series. With that, there are 9 seasons of Friendship is Magic, with 8 of those seasons having 26 episodes, and 1 season having 13 episodes, which brings the grand total to 221 episodes. However, for those of you who are familiar with my rankings, I do count the 2-parter episodes as 1 episode as opposed to 2, and with there being 15 2-parters in this series, that obviously reduces the episode count to a degree, which gives us a grand total of 206 episodes to rank, which is obviously a bit more manageable than 221, but it's still going to be quite a lot. This is going to be quite the journey, and honestly, this is one of the projects that I've been a bit more excited about with this channel. Like, this is something I've been looking forward to for a while now, and I'm now very excited to embark on it with you. And I know that this is going to be a very long process. I mean, even with dividing it into 4 parts, this is still going to be quite the adventure. And I hope that through this journey, we really get to like go through the history of MLP and really build our way up from the very worst that the show has to offer to the very best. And I hope that you all enjoy this journey along with me. So I guess that's something I'll leave you with as we get started here. But obviously, with this part, this is just going to be the bottom 10 episodes in the series. And let's not waste any more time. Let's get right into the video. So here we go. Starting off this list at number 206. Wow, what a place to start there. But we have the worst episode in Friendship is Magic. Now, if you see my season episode rankings, you should have a good idea of who the contenders are for this spot. Now, I will say that for the most part, this list will largely remain true to the placements I gave to episodes in the season episode ranking, although there will be some deviations here or there as I've definitely reassessed some episodes since doing those videos. But I feel like this bottom 10 is pretty secure to me. I mean, these are some pretty awful episodes, and I'm sure if you followed along, you should expect certain episodes to be in this part per se. However, I did have to wade through and really pick an episode to consider the worst here. But let's not waste any more time here. At number 206, the worst episode in Friendship is Magic is Yakity Sax from season 8. And again, I know that at the time I made my season 8 ranking that this was certainly a choice. I mean, I'm sure plenty of people thought that this was a bad episode. I mean, myself included, of course, and rightly dismissed it as a pretty forgettable one at the end of the day here. However, I largely stuck to my guns at the time of the season 8 video and declared it the worst episode of the worst season of the show, and now it's here at the bottom. And I largely stand by a lot of my reasoning here, which largely stems due to my love of Pinkie Pie and the fact that this episode just completely trivializes all of her character development across the course of the series. I mean, it'd be one thing if this episode was just kind of boring, I mean, and it didn't really do much to advance itself per se. However, I feel like out of all the episodes here, this is definitely the episode that really just doesn't do Pinkie any favors at all. I mean, we literally see her go through all this character development across the first 4 seasons and really beyond that of her going from this largely happy but insecure pony that seeks the approval of others to one who definitely still likes throwing parties for others but is a bit more secure in herself. And through that, that's a pretty interesting character arc for her to be in. And we see over the course of the series that others grow to appreciate her and they learn to not underestimate her so much, that she isn't just some party pony that just throws parties and shoots her party candidate and eats cupcakes and all that she's actually become someone who cares a lot about her craft. I mean, for her, parties are a source of, one, making sure that her friends are happy and maximizing happiness and fulfilling the purpose of her cutie mark, but also as a way of expressing yourself and really making it a craft of sorts, where we saw in episodes like Party Poop that she really goes out of her way to put a lot of effort and like mindfulness behind her parties in order to maximize happiness. It's sort of weird because it's both a craft but also a science for her in a lot of ways. So we really got to see a lot of appreciation for Pinkie over the course of the series here, and we see her develop and learn to become more secure in herself, that she isn't as underestimated as she was for a lot of it. And more importantly, that she recognizes that her friends like her for who she is, that they don't just like her because of what she performs on the outside or what jokes that she can give to make them laugh at any given time. I mean, she is, at the end of the day, a very real and substantial member of the main 6, which leads me right into this episode, which again feels like it completely trivializes that, where we see Pinkie just suddenly pick up this hobby one day, which, again, the fact that she picks up a yak-related hobby isn't the worst concept in the world. And considering that at this point in the series, we had a regular Yak character and Yona around, I mean, they could have definitely had her involved in this episode, and they really could have made something out of this and really tied it to Pinky's connection with the Yak culture, which was becoming a recurring storyline at this point in the series. However, we obviously see the conflict unfold here where her playing really disrupts a lot of her friends' lives. And it's not just that she's bad at playing the Yavitaphone, it's that she's practicing it in very public settings and doing it in a way that has negative and very real consequences on her friends' lives. I mean, as I said at the time of the season A video, she costs Rainbow Dash a race. She keeps all of Fluttershy's animals up all night to where she can't get any sleep, and the animals can't get any sleep because she's playing it and she scares the animals. She turns all of the apples in Sweet Apple Acres into applesauce when it isn't even saucing season. Again, just not boding well for business, not boding well for the Apple family's livelihood there. So basically, when they come to talk to Pinky about this, they have a very real set of problems to deal with here. I mean, it's not just that Pinky is playing this new thing and that she isn't very good at it. It's that she's doing it in a way to where it causes real harm. And there was a very real and practical solution to it, in which they could have either asked her to get lessons. Again, you have a Yak character at this point who could be involved with the story, but just isn't for whatever reason. And then the other approach is, okay, if you're not going to get lessons, like at least play it in areas where it's not going to disrupt people. I mean, you're not going to play it in the library, for instance. You know, you could just play it at your house, or if you want to bring it to a party, then have it be a part of that. I mean, there are other ways you could go about this, but instead, in order to create this conflict, Twilight just has to insist that the whole problem is her even daring to play the Yavitaphone in the first place, and says that she just isn't good and she should stop, and that it's just all bad. Again, just not the ideal way to go about it, and really in an unnecessary way with what the episode was literally showing us here. But that's not really the main issue with the episode. I mean, it's definitely dumb. I mean, it's not something that really helps the episode per se. But what really causes this episode to go downhill is the way in which this incident just completely deflates Pinky's self-worth, and how she uses this incident to really become depressed. And the fact that she literally had this thing that she picked up just a week ago, and to be told that she's not very good at it is enough to just completely destroy her self-confidence. It's just a very bad look in my eyes. I mean, what does it say about all the character development that Pinky went through, with her going through much more severe incidents, in my opinion? Like in Party of One, when she thought that her friends were ignoring her to the point where they didn't want to be her friends anymore. You have things like in Too Many Pinkie Pies, where all of her friends just assumed that she was this flanderized version of herself, when all these Pinky clones are running around and were being flanderized versions of herself. And that episode all was centered all around Pinky, showing them that there was a very real pony behind there, that she was a very complex pony with actual emotions and stuff, and actual motivations beyond just simply running around, laughing, just creating a ruckus out of everything. You have that. You have Pinky Pride, which again was the culmination of her character arc, where she had this pony pose a really real threat to her, and her just thinking that someone like that could easily replace her, leading her to think that her perception in the eyes of her friends is that they just see her as a source of comedy, and that source of comedy can easily be outsourced and replaced, and that without her to serve that role, that she doesn't have any utility to provide. I mean, and all those episodes I just mentioned were about her coming to realize that her friends see her as more than that they actually care about her and want to be her friend, that they just aren't there to have her parties and then go away. So we see over the course of the series that Pinky has grown in a lot of ways, and that she has grown from far more serious experiences here. But to now see all that just go out the window over something as minor as this is just completely laughable. And the episode doesn't really have any self-awareness in that regard. I mean, we just see Pinky being completely depressed and hopelessly depressed, just kind of mocking the whole idea of Pinky being depressed and becoming Pinkamena for whatever reason. I mean, again, I can understand why people may not be as upset by that as I would be, for instance. But that's really what drags down this episode for me. I mean, and on top of it being very boring, and on top of it relying on a very contrived and stupid conflict per se, just really makes this episode not enjoyable, but also pretty counterproductive to what the show has been building up, at least for one of its main characters. And to me, that is pretty inexcusable in my opinion. And that's part of the reason why I punished this episode as much as I did. And when we're factoring in all the episodes that we're going to be talking about here, I mean, admittedly, it's not the most insufferable episode. I mean, I could definitely just turn this on in the background and not get too upset on the face of it. I mean, it's really more when you get down to what this episode means in the context of the rest of the series. That being that it kind of trivializes all this stuff that Pinky went through over the course of it. I mean, whereas other episodes are just more like not fun to watch on their own. I mean, this episode definitely does more damage, I think, to the overall series than a lot of other episodes we just mentioned, or will mention, I should say. So that's really what was the decision maker for me. And while there are definitely other pretty bad episodes we'll be getting into relatively soon, I think this episode is the perfect summation of why season 8 in general was the worst season of the show. Is that it was really a season in which the writers were essentially just dumping like ideas that they probably wouldn't have used otherwise, but because it was getting around season 8 that they didn't really have anything left, and they figured that this was the best way to go about it. And yes, season 9 does utilize that to a degree. However, that season was definitely more dedicated to tying up loose ends, whereas season 8 didn't really have that going for it. I mean, the only thing it could have done really was tell more episodes about the school, but I mean, those weren't too bad at the end of the day. But again, season 8 just has these episodes that wouldn't have worked. I mean, and this late in the series. I mean, if they had happened in season 1 or season 2, then they could have worked better. But because all these characters had gone through so much character development by this point, it made it so that these episodes by season 8 were not working anymore, as it really just makes a joke out of these characters and really just forces them into really baffling behavior just to make the story work here. And certainly Yakity Sax isn't the only episode that does this. However, is the episode that I think best encapsulates this trend, and it's not a good trend for the series, and considering that it really just takes a damper on my favorite character in the show, which really just isn't good in my personal opinion. So I feel like at the end of the day, I did sum up my reasons why this is my personal least favorite episode of the series. Now I know people will definitely contest this to a degree, and again, and this really goes for all these placements on this list moving forward. These are largely my opinion anyway, and I definitely try to factor in like as many factors as I can and try to explain my reasoning as best that I can. And I understand that people may not hate this episode per se. However, for me and what I value within the series, this is definitely the worst episode for me, and a big reason that is here at number 206. Now moving on to number 205, and again, we are sticking with another pretty terrible episode, and one that I'm sure people were expecting a bit more to crack this list here, but we're actually sticking with another season 8 episode, which probably doesn't bode well for that season as a whole, but here we have A Matter of Principles, and again, I'm sure plenty of people were expecting this one to at least be in the bottom 10 here, but really, as I alluded to a moment ago with Yakity Sax, I mean, admittedly, Yakity Sax, the one thing going for it really was that it wasn't the most insufferable episode to watch per se. However, this one, I can't say at all. I mean, this was just an absolute drag to watch. I mean, really, it basically takes what I don't like about Discord, that being that he's just this nuisance that doesn't really do anything useful and just causes a lot of inconvenience, and at the end like tries to make it seem like he's teaching other characters a lesson. I mean, this is probably the worst example of that trend that happens with Discord in the series, where he literally spends the entire episode proving to Starlight why he is incompetent and why he is entirely unsuited to run the school here. And yet, by the end, we're supposed to believe that Starlight is the one that's supposed to be learning a lesson here about how she was being unfair to Discord and that she should have listened to him more, and that that's why he should have been like helping her run the school. When in reality, like, we're talking about a position of responsibility here. And by him like being such a petulant child about expressing his needs and his inability to express those needs in a mature way, like, and actually talking to Starlight about it and refusing to take no for an answer, again, just proves why someone like that should never be in that position of power or responsibility to begin with. Now, in terms of the episode itself, I mean, again, a lot of it is centered around Discord, and Discord is really the biggest problem with the episode. Where, again, getting right into the premise, he is the reason why the main six leave the school in the first place. He corrupts the friendship map here in order to send them on their quest, sending them into direct danger, all for a fake mission, which, again, not only endangers the main six, but especially endangers Fluttershy. I mean, we've seen in previous episodes that Discord cares a lot about Fluttershy and that he is willing to ensure that she is safe. I mean, we see in To Where and Back again that the biggest reason why he is motivated to help Starlight and Trixie on their mission is because Fluttershy was put into direct danger. And we've seen that in other episodes as well, like Discord and Harmony, where Discord was so willing to change himself just to make Fluttershy happy. I mean, this is the relationship we're talking about here. And yet he literally puts her in harm's way on a fake mission. He puts her in danger for no reason other than to create this power vacuum and just hoped and assumed that they would give him the responsibility. And then when he didn't get that responsibility, and when Starlight understandably said that she didn't need additional assistance, he spends the episode just making things a lot harder for her. And yet we're supposed to believe that Starlight was the one in the wrong here. I mean, I just refuse to accept that premise on any level, not to mention all the danger and inconvenience that he puts the students throughout the course of the episode, not to mention that really notable moment there where he calls Starlight an incompetent, power-hungry unicorn, which probably should have been focused on a bit more. I mean, Starlight must have been really hurt by that, and then obviously her reaction was to just banish him from the school there, so there's that as well. I mean, I'm trying to go through as much as I can to really articulate why this is the worst episode of the series, or one of them per se. And again, at everywhere that I turn, all of it comes back to Discord. I mean, the way Discord behaves in this episode is just so unlikable. And yet, the fact that the episode doesn't really put him that much in the wrong here, it's just not very good for me at the end of the day. And I know that's not very good for a lot of other people as well. So I'm not going to focus too much on this episode per se. I mean, I'm sure a lot of other people really understand at this point why this episode is so bad, and I'm not going to dwell too much on it longer, but it is very bad still, and because of that, it is here at number 205. Now moving on to number 204, and don't worry, not all these episodes on this bottom 10 will be from season 8. We actually do have quite a bit of earlier episodes to talk about here. And here we have one of them, but here we have Dragon Quest from season 2. And again, I'm sure plenty of people were expecting this as well. And arguably, this is an episode that just doesn't really work on any level. And it doesn't really click with the show's universe, or at least the show's universe by the time that it ends. Now, admittedly, the later seasons of the show do attempt to address some of the issues that permeate from this episode, like the whole confusion over the role of dragons and what exactly it means to be a dragon. Like, literally within this episode, we see at the beginning that the main six are observing the dragon migration as if they're a species of animals that aren't really sentient and aren't really civilized. But then literally the rest of the episode is dedicated to exploring dragon culture and showing that they are sentient and that they are civilized. So what are they? Are they animals, or are they like a civilized people, much like ponies are? I mean, it's very confused in that regard. And again, just sort of speaks to how confused this episode is with regard to dragons in general. Now, this is a pretty touchy episode when it comes to race issues. Now, admittedly, the episode does attempt to steer away from some of the more racial connotations between dragons and ponies by trying to make it more of a manly versus girly issue. But really, I mean, it can't really escape it despite its attempts to do so. I mean, at the end of the day, these are two different races here. These are two different cultures with very different values. And it's very much an episode that suggests that one culture is very obviously superior to that of another one. I mean, it's pretty blatant from this episode at least that dragon culture sucks and that it's really just a very toxic masculinity based culture that doesn't really bode well on any level. And that just makes a lot of this episode just not very fun to watch. I mean, we see Garble and all his Chad friends just hazing Spike for a lot of the episode, which is just not great on any particular level. It's not very fun to watch. It obviously culminates with them trying to murder some poor Phoenix egg, only for Spike to save it and really just use that to stand up to the dragons. And by the end, like, he kind of comes around to, it's not about what I am, it's about who I am, which, okay, like, I kind of get what message they were going for. But again, it's like the episode is almost sort of aware of the baggage that comes with this particular story, and it does try to sweep it under the rug to a degree, but just given the nature of the story, it's just completely unable to do so. And I actually feel like in attempting to do so, it just makes things more muddled than anything else. Like, again, as I alluded to a moment ago, like, are the dragons sentient? Are we expected to view them as equals to that of ponies in terms of their civilization per se? And then if we don't, and they're just to be animals, sort of like what we saw with the migration, then that's not particularly great. But also, if we do expect them to be equals and they are supposed to be a group with a particular culture, then it's pretty clear that the culture presented in this episode doesn't paint the dragons in that good of a light either. So, again, it's not really a comfortable episode to deal with on any level. And again, it is sort of helped by the fact that future seasons do try to address some of those issues, but even then, not in a super direct way. I mean, this episode is just a large, muddled mess, and I've already talked about it several times in previous videos. So again, like a matter of principles, I'm not going to spend too much time talking about it here, but it's just not very good. It's not very well constructed. And even the message, like, I kinda get what they were getting, but again, they had to really ignore a lot there. And even then, I don't think they cover it up super well. So just the mess. I'm sure no one really wants to dwell on it. And it is here on number 204. Now moving on to number 203. And we got another pretty bad episode to talk about here. But here we have Princess Spike from season 5. And this was another one I'm sure plenty of people were expecting. Now, honestly, I don't even think it's that bad of an episode, at least in terms of watching it. Again, it's not the most insufferable. It's not the most annoying in the world, at least when I'm watching it. However, as I said in the past, it is a fundamentally broken episode, and I've already talked about a lot of those issues in my previous videos. I mean, just to go through them, you have Spike being blamed for all this mess happening and the Summit Hall being ruined because he was doing things in good faith. I mean, he was put in charge of Twilight getting a good night's sleep, all while this stuff was happening right outside the room. I mean, you had them taking care of those trees, you had them taking care of the water pipe, you had all this stuff happening. And now, obviously, you could say that they should have just put Twilight in a more secluded area, maybe an area that stuff wasn't quite as audible from there. Or even better, Cadence could have at least told Spike about all this stuff that was happening right outside that regarded the summit. I mean, certainly they could have been able to hear from there, or perhaps someone could have come along and told them that this stuff was necessary to be done in order for the summit to happen smoothly. And yet Spike, understandably, tries to stop all this, thinking that he's doing the right thing, only for it to blow up. And yet by the end, he not only gets punished for it, but we're expected to believe that all this stemmed from his episode of him getting all greedy and taking advantage of Twilight's position. And yes, he does indulge in that a little bit and does a couple things in the name of Princess Twilight's business per se. But the real stuff that causes things to go wrong towards the end, the stuff that gets Twilight in trouble, the stuff that gets Spike himself in trouble, and the stuff that Spike owns up to towards the end, that was not born of malice at all. And all of it just comes off as a pretty lame attempt at a Spike torture porn at the end of the day. So not particularly great in that regard. And again, it doesn't really work on any particular level. I mean, even if we take everything else out, it's a largely boring episode. I mean, Spike just goes about his business, and then we see all the convention goers basically acting like petulant children who are incapable of solving any problems on their own and have to turn to Twilight in order to do it. And for some reason, none of the other princesses are around to resolve it, so they have to go to Twilight while she is trying to get her sleep. And there's no other explanation that they're given for why she can't be there for the time being. I mean, they could have at least said that she was busy with other royal duties in preparation for the event. I mean, presumably you would think that's part of the reason why the other princesses wouldn't be able to do anything. And certainly, like, all these convention goers would understand that the princesses have other things to do besides doing this convention, that they have more things to deal with than these one-on-one meetings with these different representatives. So at the end of the day, I can't really reward this episode too much. It's pretty bad at the end of the day, and it's really broken. I mean, I can't really assign any merits to it whatsoever. There's nothing I can really get from this episode that is necessarily good. However, to its credit, it's not as insufferable to watch as something like A Matter of Principles, and it doesn't break the series to the same degree as stuff like Yakity Sax, for example, or even Dragon Quest. So I did have it a couple spots higher, but really it's just not very good at all. So because of that, it is here at number 203. Now moving on to number 202, and we have another season 5 episode to talk about, which is sort of weird because I actually do like season 5 quite a bit, but this episode has no business being any higher than here. And here we have Appaloosa's Most Wanted. Now, admittedly, this episode is definitely one of the more or less pleasant episodes to watch. I mean, it's just not fun seeing Trouble Shoes just completely screwing up at everything he does, and then him just being an outcast and just having no hope of doing anything of value at the end of the day. And even the ending where the CMC help him realize the value of his cutie mark, that he's meant to be an entertainer. I mean, while that is supposed to be presented as uplifting, I mean, it really isn't. I mean, at the end of the day, Trouble Shoes' cutie mark is to humiliate himself so badly that others start laughing at him instead of punishing him and causing him to be an outcast. So I feel like even that isn't a particularly good fate, and I don't feel good about Trouble Shoes' future moving forward. And the fact that he has to go to jail even after all that is just like, why? I mean, you're already teaching him that his purpose in life is to be a clown, basically. And while he's fine with that, I mean, just the additional detail of him going to jail, like, I get what they were doing, but still, it just doesn't add to the fun at all. Aside from that, I mean, the episode isn't particularly great. I mean, the CMC are largely in the driver's seat here with them helping Trouble Shoes figure it out. And that's really it. I mean, Trouble Shoes is what really drags down this episode, and just his treatment and the fact that he just can't catch a break. And even the message at the end doesn't really do much to propel it per se. However, the main reason I did have it a couple spots above the episodes we just mentioned is that despite the message not really working on its own, it does at least offer a positive contribution to the series in that it suggests to them CMC that their purpose does lie with helping other ponies find out the purpose of their cutie mark. And while we see that playing out here in a not super fun way, with Trouble Shoes not really having that great of a cutie mark, it does at least set that storyline up for when the CMC do eventually get their cutie marks in the Crusaders of the Lost Mark. So at least there's that. At least it does tie into some broader story trend within the series, and at least that implication is somewhat positive in context with the rest of the series. However, the episode itself is just a drag, in my personal opinion. It's just not very fun at all. So because of that, I do have it here at number 202. Now moving on to number 201. And this is an episode that I'm a little surprised is as high as it is. However, all things considered, I mean, it kind of fits here, but it is still a pretty awful episode. But here we have from season 9, 246 Great. And I feel like this is an episode where the message isn't as awful as the episodes we already talked about, whether it's the content of the message or its execution. However, I still think it is still pretty undermined by a few things. I mean, for one, the fact that Rainbow never actually signed up to be the coach of the cheer squad. Now, I understand the message they were going for in the sense that you can't always do things that you want to do, and that sometimes you just have to do things for other people in your life because that's just what being a good person is. And I get that. However, there was no reason why Twilight should have looked at Rainbow Dash and thought that she would be this great selection to be, the coach of the cheer squad, when it's very obvious that she was much rather do the buckball team, even though, again, they literally have two professional buckball players, technically three actually, on the team already. So I understand why Rainbow wasn't put there, but Twilight pretty much had no reason to think that Rainbow would have succeeded in this position. And it leads to a pretty predictable outcome here where Rainbow spends a lot of the episode not really caring about what the other students are thinking and doesn't really care about the success of the cheer squad, which isn't really pleasant, especially in the scene where Rainbow is telling them that no one cares and that everyone just goes up to get a snack while they're performing. I mean, that's not particularly ideal. And obviously we see each of them walking out, getting disappointed with Rainbow Dash. And again, yeah, at the end of the day, Rainbow is technically being selfish here. However, again, I mean, the fact that she was put into this position to begin with, I mean, again, I get what they were going for, but even then, like, she shouldn't have been put in that position to begin with, as she doesn't seem to have any expertise when it comes to coaching cheer squad outside of just her being really passionate, I guess. You also have the whole thing with Snips in that he's trying to talk about this vested interest and how he's trying to blame Rainbow Dash for being selfish, when literally the only reason that he's even involved with the cheer squad is so that he can make money off merchandise. So they're both being selfish here, and yet we're supposed to believe that Snips is not as selfish as Rainbow Dash is, despite him literally talking about vested interests. The fact that he makes it sound like Rainbow has a vested interest to begin with is just completely ridiculous. I mean, Rainbow has no connection to Snips whatsoever and had no reason to go along with his plan of helping him sell merchandise so that he can be selfish. I mean, it doesn't really make any sense on any level there. And all it does is really kind of undermine the message as well, to where the whole reason why Rainbow is forced to be selfless here is because she was forced into this position after others wanted her to be involved with it, despite her not really having much of a reason to. And literally, one of the key actors in all this, Snips, was himself being very, very selfish, and they don't seem to recognize that too much. Plus, I don't even get what direction they're going in there to begin with, so I don't even know what value he has here other than, well, Snails is on the team, therefore he has to also be involved with the cheer squad, I guess. So at the end of the day, this is a pretty confusing episode. Admittedly, the message itself isn't as bungled as the other episodes we talked about, despite those factors I just mentioned, which is a big reason why it's at least a couple spots higher compared to those other episodes, but still not good. And the fact that we had to see Rainbow being completely selfish, and the fact that it's so obvious from early on that Rainbow has no business being involved with the cheer squad, and yet she's forced into it, and everyone is just berating her over and over again for not being able to be an effective coach. It's just, I don't know. I mean, it's not very fun seeing that aspect to it. It's not really fun seeing Rainbow being completely selfish for a lot of it. And through that, I can't really reward this episode too much. So because of that, I do have to leave it here as one of the worst episodes. It's here at number 201. Now we're moving on to number 200, and I did have to think about this one a little bit over whether it was really worthy of being in the bottom 10. However, after thinking about some more, I decided to include it, even though I don't think it's really the very, very worst. But here we have the end in Friends from season 8. And Similar to Yakity Sax, this is essentially a worthless episode. And that's a big reason why I don't think it's very good at all. I mean, it's literally an episode that probably could have worked a bit better had it been in season 1 or season 2, where you have Rainbow and Rarity being these opposite personalities that don't really have a lot of in common, or at least not on the surface, and not really have much of a reason to be friends with each other, but through the episode kind of learn to put aside their differences and learn that they do have some commonalities. Again, if this were a season 1 episode, I mean, it would be not great, but it would at least be understandable. And in fact, we literally have an episode like that within season 1, only instead of Rainbow Dash, it's with Applejack, and we'll get that episode soon enough. But the fact that it's here in season 8, literally after Rainbow and Rarity have gone through so much together. I mean, not just with saving Equestria over and over again, but also having an episode dedicated to each other in Rarity Investigates, where Rarity literally proves Rainbow Dash wrong in terms of her seeming like she didn't really do anything and was doing things her own way, but in doing so was able to help out Rainbow Dash, like help her save her dream per se. So that we literally have seen them bond one-on-one in the past, on top of everything else we've seen before. And yet, this episode has them come to the quote unquote shocking realization that they don't have anything in common. And yet, despite getting along perfectly fine before then, this realization is just enough to send them into just bickering for a lot of the episode. And that's not fun at all. And it's just such a drag, just waiting for them to go off on their adventure so that they can relearn their friendship, I guess. So again, this episode is pretty bad. And like I said with the Yakity Sax, this is a perfect encapsulation of the trend with season 8 and some other later season episodes, but particularly with season 8, this trend of episodes that probably would have been used earlier, but just weren't very good and just were sort of tossed until the last possible moment. And with this episode falling here, I mean, it just falls pretty flat in my personal opinion. So at the end of the day, I can't really reward this episode too much. However, the main reason I do have it above the ones we just talked about is that despite it being completely ridiculous, the message itself I can't say is bad at all. This is probably the first episode on the list where the message isn't completely messed up per se. As again, in a vacuum, this episode sort of kind of works, but in context, it just falls apart. So because of that, it is here at number 200. Now we're moving on to number 199. And again, we are still inside this bottom 10. And we have a pretty traditionally hated episode. Mind you, one that probably isn't as hated now, especially since it came out so long ago, but really one that deserves to be here. But here we have the mysterious Mare duel. And honestly, coming into this project, I was a little surprised that it even made the bottom 10, as obviously it is a pretty bad episode and one that doesn't really work on any level per se. I mean, I 100% subscribe to a lot of the criticisms that people ascribe to this episode, both at the time that it came out and even now. However, I kind of thought that with time passing that it wouldn't seem as bad as, like maybe people thought it was at the time. But after just thinking about it more and more, I mean, I can't really defend this episode too much. Now, the one thing I will sort of defend it for is that scene kind of towards the beginning where we see Rainbow first get her praise and she kind of gets embarrassed by it to a degree, and her just being completely like fluttery over the idea of people looking up to her, of people giving her the attention to begin with, was a minor positive to the episode and one that made it slightly interesting in my eyes. But then afterwards, it just completely goes downhill. We obviously get the whole scheme where each of the main 6 take turns being the Mare duel and really just one-upping Rainbow Dash at every single opportunity, just completely humbling her in the process. And again, people have talked about this before. This is such a ridiculous scheme to really humble Rainbow Dash. And the whole message of learning to be humble to begin with is completely undermined when each of the main 6 take turns talking about how amazing the Mare duel is. Like, they literally talk in the Sugar Cube Corner with Rainbow Dash in sight, talking about, oh wow, look at the mysterious Mare duel, look at how awesome they are and how they're doing all these great things, and they're so humble. I mean, it's like, what are you doing at this point? So, yes, I can't really defend it too much. And as I talked about with certain other episodes before, it really highlights this degree of self righteousness that just doesn't sit well with me. I mean, the fact that these main six people are just patting themselves on the back over this Mare gimmick versus actually just telling Rainbow point blank that she's being too selfish and she's basking in the spotlight too much, which honestly, like the fact that Rainbow Dash is even in the spotlight to begin with, the fact that she relishes in it, I mean, it's not that bad at the end of the day. I mean, granted, I mean, it's a bit more justified, like the whole scheme compared to what we see in another episode, which we'll be talking about a bit soon on this list. However, again, like as long as Rainbow Dash isn't actively creating situations where her heroism is needed, then I mean, what bad is there to her being a little selfish other than just her being a bit annoying? So at the end of the day, I can't really defend this episode too much. I mean, the message is very questionable. I mean, in terms of its execution, the fact that the main six aren't more upfront with Rainbow Dash about how her being selfish is pretty annoying and how it's not very good, and the fact that they resort to the scheme that obviously humbles Rainbow Dash and kind of makes her sad and humiliated, but also just using that opportunity to pat themselves on the back just is not a good look either. So again, I can't defend this episode too much, and because of that, it is here at number 199. Now moving on to number 198, and we have an episode pretty similar to the Mysterious Mirror Duel in that it's a widely hated episode, a traditionally hated episode that's been around for quite a while at this point, but here we have One Bad Apple. And similar to the Mysterious Mirror Duel, this is a classic bad episode of MLP, and one that I can't really justify at the end of the day. And honestly, I'm a little surprised it's as high as it is, considering how it doesn't really handle the bully message super well at all. And to be clear, it is not handled well at all. I mean, the fact that Applejack fails to explain to Apple Bloom that like Babseeds was bullied in Manhattan, that this was largely an escape for her. The fact that she left out that crucial piece of information that you think she would have shared much earlier before Babseeds even came to Ponyville, just at the right moment to invalidate the CMC's bullying, all the pain and suffering they went through, and paint them in the wrong. It's just a really bad contrivance and one that just really doesn't bode well for me. Obviously, the whole message about the cycle of bullying and how if you bully someone who's been bullied, then you are a bully, even though that person bullied you, which in turn should give you an excuse to bully them. It gets very convoluted very quickly. Now, I do give them some credit for acknowledging the fact that life can be so ironic and how this cycle is something that's pretty bad. But the fact that Babseeds doesn't really get much of a comeuppance other than, I guess, redeeming herself by pushing Diamond Tiara and Silver Spoon into the mud just isn't enough, in my personal opinion. I mean, it's pretty underwhelming at the end of the day. Again, the fact that Applejack is very much useless in this episode and only serves to paint the CMC in the wrong by delivering that piece of information at the convenient time. The fact that she couldn't have given that information sooner is pretty bad. The fact that Applejack fails to pick up on all the bad stuff that's happening around the orchard, and the fact that Apple Bloom is very much upset about the situation, the fact that Babseeds is even sleeping in her bed. I mean, the fact that Applejack just fails to pick up on this stuff over and over again, despite there being multiple opportunities to do so, is a really bad look for her as well, and just kind of teaches this message that adults are pretty useless when it comes to bullying, and that at the end of the day, like, kids that are bullied should just try to deal with it themselves, which, again, not the best thing to teach at the end of the day, so there's that. Now, one other positive I do attribute to this episode is the beginning of the episode when Babseeds first arrives in Ponyville. Like, I do like that couple of minutes at the beginning when we see Babs, like, acting pretty nervous, like, and she isn't sure what to expect. And it's only when, like, she sees Diamond Tiara, like, causing trouble for her Apple Bloom that she kind of gets a thrill out of that to a degree. So, I mean, there's at least that aspect to it, and we see this sort of somewhat natural progression of how a Babseeds becomes like influenced by Diamond Tiara and Silver Spoon into bullying the CMC for the rest of the episode. So I do find that aspect a little amusing. And I know some people talk about the song as well. I mean, again, the song's okay. I mean, it's not my personal cup of tea at the end of the day, but it's not like a bad song either. So for me, it comes out as a bit of a wash in my personal opinion. But it's just the fact that this episode just really messes up the message at every opportunity. The fact that the episode does do things that kind of irk me from a storytelling perspective, particularly with Applejack's role within the episode, does make it one of the worst episodes in the series for me. But it does have a couple positives that do leave it from the very, very bottom. So because of that, I do have it here at number 198. And finally, at number 197, the 10th worst episode in MLP Friendship is Magic is Just for Sidekicks from season 3. And this episode, again, is pretty much the quintessential Spike torture porn in the sense that Spike literally has to pay in such a drastic and such a very blatant way for his selfishness, where, yeah, he does get a bit selfish, where he takes on more than he can chew by babysitting all of the pets in exchange for like all the gems. But yet he has to give up all the gems one by one, which is just pretty ridiculous. I mean, I get that they wanted to teach the message that Spike shouldn't be so selfish and that like pet sitting should be more than just your own personal gain, but they really just hammer it home to such a degree that it just becomes a bit cruel and mean-spirited at the end of the day. Like, why does the train conductor like only take gems as currency, especially when gems are supposed to be considered food by someone like a Spike, or as jewelry for someone like a Rarity, for instance? So it doesn't make any sense other than to just reinforce that Spike is someone that deserves to be punished. So that's not particularly fun. And really, that's pretty much it with this episode. It's just not a very fun episode, just a very mean-spirited episode that doesn't really provide much in terms of comedy, doesn't really provide much in terms of characterization, and even the one minor pro in that it is an episode that technically is bonded to another episode, that being Gaines Pony's Play, isn't really enough to catapult it beyond this bottom tier. But again, compared to the other episodes in the bottom 10, I can't really say that its message is flawed per se. It's just that it's really hammered home to the point where it becomes unpleasant to watch. So again, I can't really reward the episode too much outside of that. But again, there are enough merits there to where it's not the very bottom, but it's still a very not fun episode to watch. So because of that, I do have it here at number 197. And there we go. That will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps out with the channel. Now, I do plan to release part 2 relatively soon. Like, ideally, I want to do like one part a week, sort of to make this process not super duper long at the end of the day. Although, as I alluded to earlier, I mean, part 2 is going to be very, very long. I mean, it's literally going to go from 196 up to 101, so a lot of episodes to cover in that span. And admittedly, a lot of episodes that are not super great at the end of the day, though ones that are not the worst of the worst per se. And I know some people may disagree with these episodes that I consider to be the worst. However, at the end of the day, it is my list. And again, like, you are free to disagree with me if you want. I mean, that's part of why I'm doing all this. This is sort of my assessment of these episodes and just sharing my personal and honest thoughts on them. So that's really what I have to say in that regard. But obviously, these parts will be coming out soon. This is going to be a pretty fun project for me to work on, and I hope you guys are enjoying it as well. So stay tuned for that. Also, be sure to join the Discord server. I'll leave a link for it in the description, so check that out as well. But for now, that is the video. See ya.